Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this BASEES Talks, Communism and After 1991 to 2021. I'm Matthias Neumann, I'm the current president of BASEES, and I will hand over straight away to my predecessor, Professor Judith Pallot, to introduce the panel and the speakers.
Welcome, everybody, to this BASEES special event. Had we been able to hold our usual conference this year, we would have certainly themed it around the anniversary of the, or the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the USSR and the birth of the Russian Federation. This was, of course, not to be, thanks to COVID, but we didn't want 2021 to pass without the opportunity to share the thoughts of leading scholars and commentators on 1991 and post-Soviet Russia to share their thoughts with us. We're fortunate to have with us today two people who can talk about 1991 and what happened subsequently from the viewpoint of people who were actually there at the time and were already, of a sufficient age or sentience to be involved and take a view on what was going on. We have Professor Vladimir Mau, and I had the pleasure of meeting Vladimir Mau in the late 1980s, I think it was, Vladimir, when he visited Christchurch in Oxford. And I think it's very easy nowadays to forget just how unusual it was to be able to invite academics from the Soviet Union to UK university and have a normal open conversation with them. So it's very nice to see you again, Vladimir. I remember that time with great pleasure. Our other speaker today is Vladimir Gelman, who's just told me he was 26 at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so he was young and energetic and really very involved as an activist in the democratic movement in Leningrad between 1989 and 1991. And he's now a colleague of mine at the Alexandria Institute in Helsinki. And I can share a secret with you about him, which isn't really a secret at all. He has a sort of obsession and penchant for dolphins, which I've never quite understood, but this is one of the interesting features of the second Vladimir today. And the discussion is going to be led by our very own Mark Harrison, who initially was, like a lot of us in the West, watched what was happening from afar with a certain amount of surprise, because of course none of the leading Sovietologists had predicted that what happened was going to happen. But he's just shared with me the thought when I asked about his view of the events of 1991. He said, well, he went to Russia in 1992 and he was had the privilege as an economist to see a society disintegrating into hyperinflation, and then of course being able to leave and come home. So you all will realize that this is a webinar that you are involved in today, which is why I'm afraid that we can't see you, but you can see us. If you want to ask questions, please put them in the chat room, and then towards the end of the session, we'll have the opportunity to put your questions to both of the speakers. So over to you, Mark. You haven't got your microphone on, Mark.
Sure, sign of the amateur. Thank you, Judith, and thank you also to our two panelists for this evening. It's an honor to speak to you both. And I'd like to begin by asking you to cast your minds back to exactly 30 years ago, so October 1991, which came in between the two decisive events of that year. One was the August Putsch, and the one that came after was the meeting of the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and the Belarus Accords, which directly precipitated the end of the Soviet Union. So in this moment of the autumn of 1991, I'd like each of you just to tell us what you were doing, what your activities, what your thoughts were, what did you hope would happen, who did you follow, who did you see as people to be avoided, and that kind of thing. So I'd like to begin by asking Professor Mau, and then I'll turn to Professor Gelman. So Professor Mau, tell us about 30 years ago.
Well, first of all, let me thank you very much. Thank you, Mark and Judith, for this invitation, this German conference. We're starting with this type of events, this type of communication. And I'm very glad to see all of you. Of course, Vladimir Gelman as well, but we meet also more online than offline, more frequently than with both of you. First of all, by the way, Judith, we met I think in 1990 at the last International Conference of Soviet Studies in Harrogate. That was the last Soviet Studies conference when Soviet Union existed, and when Soviet scholars first and the last time were invited to this event. And then we worked when I was in Christchurch in 1997. We were very close working and discussing various ideas, including part of some of the ideas which maybe I would refer to in this discussion. By the end of the 80s, I was a scholar of Institute of Economics of Soviet Academy of Science, had a course in Moscow State University on stages of economic history of the Soviet Union. But in the fall of 1990, Igor Gaidar, who just led the Institute for Economic Policy, who now is under his name, unfortunately. Fortunately, then under his name, unfortunately that he died 11 years ago. Igor Gaidar invited to organize and chair the Central Department for Political Economy, and he particularly stressed that it would not be political economy of the Soviet type. It would be political economy like Huntington studies, Western type of political economy. At that time, I started working on this, but I spent only a year in this institute. Well, frankly speaking, when he invited me in autumn of 1990, to join the institute, I said that it would be quite a strange choice for me, because in a year you would become a member of the government, and what shall we do? Before this, I worked in the Institute of Economics, where Director Academician Abalkin became the member of the government, and the institute was without the director for another couple of years, and it was a bit boring. Without the leading economist. Gaidar told me that it was unlikely that if he joined the government, it would happen in 2 or 3 years. But it was exactly, well, my forecast, I would not say that I often, I very rarely do proper forecast, but by that time I was precise. In a year, he became Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian government. So by the autumn of 1991, I was the head of the department on political economy. I was a bit, I must confess that I was very skeptical about prospects of liberalization of prices. I was very skeptical because I had some strong concern about social consequences of this, social sustainability, social and political sustainability, and then turned out that nevertheless it worked. Without liberalization of prices, situation would have been much worse. Now we understand it. And in November, by the way, when this government was formed, on the 6th of November 1991, I was in London. I was in Britain, and it was a very interesting period. The new government is forming there. I was in Britain. I was invited even to Downing Street to press secretary of John Major, who was justice for the first year in the office. And it was strange. It was considered about nothing because I didn't know what was happening in Russia. They didn't know what to ask me because it was a total mess. But when I came back to Russia, Igor asked me to join as his assistant, as at that time as deputy prime minister. And since this time, I worked several times in the government. So if enough for presentation of this.
Were you hopeful for the future at that time? Was it a good time?
Well, you know, by this time I was very deeply involved in the analysis of logic of revolutions. And about 1987, I thought my co-author, Irina Starobrovsky and myself, we thought that the situation reminds revolution very much. And we started to study this topic. And for me, it was a bureaucratic activity, but it was also very important observations of the inside, because, well, you know, Lenin wrote that it's more interesting to make revolution than to write about it, and that's what. Well, I understood that it was a revolution, and we can in more detail discuss it later why. And to my mind, it's very important for understanding of the logic and consequences of post-Soviet transition. It's very important to consider it as a real full-scale revolution. I will elaborate on this if you write this question. For me, it's an extremely important topic for the net. But by this step, I just thought that to be in the center of radical stage of revolution. Of course, my friends, my colleague did like radicals, but it was really a radical state, because if we put it in perspective of 1970-1929 events, of course, the August Putsch of 1991 was like a Kornilov coup. And it was clear that the declaration would come. And for me to be in the center of the government, which has to realize a radical program, not necessarily with radical measures. The logic of radicalism is, people sometimes think that radicals support are very strong in ideology. Radicals are very flexible. The heroes of early stage of revolution are very ideologically committed. Radicals, they have to survive physically and politically, and they have to do everything to survive. And this is the logic of the radical stage.
Thank you. Professor Gelman, tell us what you were doing first.
Well, in October 1991, I was a young scholar in the Institute of Sociology of the Academy of Science. And at that time, I was very much uncertain what to do, because for previous year and a half, I combined two roles. One of these roles was active participation in democratic movement, but after the failure of COPE, this movement was more or less over. And at the same time, I was very much uncertain in terms of scholarship. But October 1991 was exactly the time when I got a sort of winning lottery ticket. A British scholar from Oxford, Mary Macaulay, came to St. Petersburg. It was just renamed from Leningrad to St. Petersburg in September, and she looked for someone who may serve as her research assistant for the project of study of local politics in Russia. And my colleagues recommended me to her. We met in the Institute of Sociology, had a number of conversations, and in the end, Mary offered me my first serious job. She hired me as her research assistant for a year to work with local media sources, to arrange interviews with local politicians, and so on and so forth. And next year of 1992, thanks to Mary, I was able to have my first ever academic visit to Oxford. This was the time when we met first time with Judith. And after this experience of being a research assistant, I become more deeply involved in study of politics, and turned into, well, still self-educated. I never got any formal education in political science, but well, this experience and numerous conversations with Mary somehow substituted study of politics in a more serious way. So this was very much a turning point of my professional career. It happens exactly 30 years ago. I don't know whether or not Mary is in our audience, but it's a good opportunity to thank her for what she did 30 years ago, and what she continued to do for a while after that.
And if I may ask you the same question, how did you feel about what you saw going on around you? Were you hopeful? Did you feel engaged, committed? What were you for and what were you against?
Well, at that time, there was a great uncertainty. And every day brought some new information, and I was a little bit disoriented, because I saw that, okay, Soviet Union is about to cease to exist. But at the same time, it looks like well, some sort of getting certificate of divorce. Everybody already understood that the Soviet Union is over, and then there was a question of how it will disappear. And in my view, the disappearance of the Soviet Union was done, how to say, not in the best possible way, but at least worst case scenarios were avoided. Also, economic situation was very much uncertain, and nobody knows what to predict and what to expect. And this was probably the time of greatest uncertainty during this period of revolution, which Professor Mau mentioned. But at the same time, it was no signs of total hopelessness and disaster. It was the time of many concerns and many fears, but there was some sort of well, post-revolutionary enthusiasm of many people, and there was well, the time of certain hopes. Well, if I may, I would summarize by a classical statement. Dickens, this was the best of times and the worst of times.
Thank you.
By the way, that was an epigraph to our book, The Challenge of Revolution. Exactly.
Okay, great.
From the cities.
So the end of communism, violent in some places. For example, in Yugoslavia, it was violent. It took violent forms in some of the former Soviet republics. Did either of you worry that this might be a movement towards civil war? in Russia? Or did that not seem likely to you? I'll ask Professor Mau first.
Me?
Mike.
Well, you know, first of all, revolution is not just about violence. I would insist that revolution is a radical transformation of the system with the in the situation of the course of the government. Well, it's not about violence. Violence depends on the level of economic activity. Violence is much higher in the country with domination of agrarian rural poor population, when people doesn't have much to lose. In the city, in the urban countries, of course, the role of violence is not as important. So I would stress that violence is not a constitutional element of revolution. For us, it was very, very important and very dangerous because Russian transition was developing in comparison with Yugoslavian disintegration. And for us, it was a very important challenge, and one of our main tasks was to avoid it. Let's not forget that Igor Gaidar spent his childhood in Yugoslavia, in Serbia to be precise, in Belgrade, and for him, he spoke Serbian, and for him it was particularly painful experience. So the point to avoid, how to avoid civil war, how to avoid Yugoslavian scenario was very, very important. And it was another very important element of the discussion. Let's not forget that there were Russia and 3 other republics which Soviet republics were obtained nuclear armament. And for us, the focal point was not even economic reform. Economic reform was crucially important, but how to take nuclear armaments out of neighbor post-Soviet republics.
Professor Gelman, did you worry about violence?
I completely agree with Professor Mau that this peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union was an essential element. And not only from the viewpoint of use of nuclear arms, but also from the viewpoint of numerous ethnic conflicts ranging from Nagorno-Karabakh to Transnistria, and certainly for Russia, it was important to be not involved in these conflicts, which were already on by itself, and try to avoid the risk of major confrontations with its neighbors or territories or resources and the like. Even if disintegration of Yugoslavia, which was in the full swing by that time, was a powerful reminder how one should not act. It was a risk that this disintegration process will involve long and tedious and probably useless negotiations, and certainly it will not enable Russia to launch these market reforms because of this great uncertainty. This is why I believe that Belovesh Agreement was probably the least unacceptable solution, as it was one of agreement and some sort of quick divorce, which was a better alternative vis-a-vis long and very much difficult process of divorce. Without Belavesh agreement, probably steps toward economic changes would be much more problematic and less productive, not only for Russia but also for its neighbors. I think so.
Thank you. Now, what I'd like to suggest now is that we step back from the moment of 1991 and consider more broadly the beginning and the end of this revolutionary process. So we could think of the 1980s, when the beginning of the 1980s, Brezhnev was still the Soviet leader. By the end of the 1990s, Yeltsin, the first Russian president, was on the way out. So there's a 20-year period that you can think of as the period in which this revolution took place. And I wonder what each of you would think of as the decisive moments or trends. You know, was it the decision to choose Gorbachev as the leader, or were there underlying forces that would have led to the same outcome anyway? Did Andropov represent an alternative path of evolution for Russia if we lived longer? There are many things here that we might discuss, but I wonder what strikes you as a sort of fundamental turning point in this process. Can I start by asking Professor Mau then? What would you see as what strikes you in retrospect as the historic moments for Russia in this revolutionary process? You need to unmute yourself, Professor.
Please turn on your mic.
Yes, sorry. You mean the point of no return in the Soviet or post-Soviet time? Because there are two different approaches.
Yes, let's start in Soviet times. Is there a point of no return?
You know, in terms of Soviet time, I would share the view of Yegor Gaidar, which he wrote, which he described and analyzed in several of his books, The Demise of the Empire, the long time, where he wrote that the decisive point, the last attempt to have a peaceful transformation of communism was in the turn of 1960s, 1970s. Yeah, well, it was the Kosygin reform of 1965. My first book in my life, which I wrote, was about intellectual preparation of this reform, which I like very much. And then for political reasons, it was stopped. But then Soviet authorities tried to continue reformation in the early 70s, but then oil shock arrived. And after oil shock, Soviet economy adjusted to high oil prices. That was the point of no return, because you can easily adjust your economy, your social sector, the level of consumption to high oil prices, but you could not symmetrically put it down after when oil prices go down. And this artificial adjustment to very high level of rent revenue was the point which transformed structure of Soviet economy without real opportunity to change situation when and if oil prices go down. Of course, Soviet authorities had an excuse. They had never seen, and nobody had ever seen, oil prices going down. That was the first case. Oil prices go up, but they didn't believe. The discussion was whether they would go up forever or they would reach plateau and stay on the plateau. But it never occurred to anybody in the 70s that the situation could change radically back. And by the early 80s, Soviet economy, Soviet social system, Soviet welfare state was adjusted, was constructed to live with very high rent revenue. And it meant the result was that when economic background changed, it could not be soft, peaceful adjustment. That's very important difference from, say, Chinese example. We have to take it into consideration comparing with China. There are some other very important elements, and if you like, we could discuss about comparison of the why Russia could follow Chinese way in 1929. Actually, the Bukharian concept of socialism was what Deng Xiaoping tried to realize in the late 70s, early 80s. But the Soviet Union was completely different structurally country, and of course it was a point of no return. In terms of revolution, I would say that very important point was financial crisis of 1998. One of the dangers we saw that political system will not survive another devaluation, another sharp crisis, and the Soviet economy and Soviet political system overcame financial crisis of 1998. Moreover, the left-wing government of Primakov and communists realized most constantly the economic program of Gaidar of 1992. Actually, it is very interesting, but the most constant realization of this program and complete realization happened in 1992 and 1999. When 1998, 1999, when budget was balanced, when macroeconomic, or most of the macroeconomic problems were resolved. And I wanted to stress it happened before oil prices started to grow. It was not the result of high oil price, of growing oil price. It was the result of political stabilization. And that was very important. And that was the point of no return in economic meaning of this word. I mean, no return to socialist planned economy.
So there are some very interesting things here to discuss about the 90s, but I'm just going to ask Professor Gelman to talk to us about how you see the 1980s and was there a point of no return in the revolutionary process?
Well, when we are talking about late Soviet period, I would say that the very process of reforms initiated by Gorbachev was a point of no return because he generally wanted to improve the Soviet system and its performance, but first he had no ideas of what should be done. And second, he underestimated the degree of problems he faced. In particular, he misunderstood the nature of the Soviet system and not taking into account this problem of imperial nation state, and this was one of the weakest points, and another one was quite irresponsible socio-economic policy, which was analyzed in Gaidar's book Collapse of an Empire in many details. And every time when we discuss with the students problems of the Soviet collapse, I suggest them a sort of thought experiment. Imagine that you you took a time machine, come to Gorbachev's office in 1985. You know what happens actually, and you suggest Gorbachev to do something else. And students actively involved, they discuss whether or not there was a Chinese alternative available or doing something else. But in the end, they usually come to conclusions that the best solution for Gorbachev would be just tend to preserve the declining status quo and doing nothing. And most probably, if this advice could be taken seriously, at the moment we will celebrate 90th anniversary of the Secretary General Gorbachev, praise him, and certainly not discuss the issues of the Soviet collapse. It's just a joke. As to post-Soviet times, I believe that there was no one point of no return, but several waves of changes. My understanding is that by the end of 1990s, this revolutionary process, I completely agree with Professor Mau that it was a real full-scale revolution. So by the end of 1990s, the revolutionary process was over. And then there was a start of a new epoch of post-revolutionary stabilization with all its pluses and minuses. But overall, there was the whole end of this post-Soviet transformation. And yes, probably 1998 economic crisis was the end of this period in economic terms and set up further developments. Yes.
This time machine of yours is very interesting. I started here wondering about if it had gone back a couple of years earlier to the office of Andropov, perhaps with a kidney from the future, and told him what would happen next if things went on as they were going. Do you think that a longer-lived and more determined Andropov could have put off this revolution? I'm asking Professor Gelman, but I'll turn after that to Professor.
Okay. Frankly speaking, Andropov nowadays more perceived as a sort of myth of possible alternative history. What could happen if he not died in 1984? My understanding is that most probably there was no way for radical changes similarly to those under Gorbachev, but there could be attempts of some sort of muddling through numerous problems of the Soviet economy, foreign policy, and the like. And I'm not sure that there was a way to prevent revolutionary changes completely because of the problems Professor Mau mentioned. But there was probably an opportunity to postpone it for a while. But anyway, the structural problems of the Soviet Union related to its economy, to its political design and the like were in place, and most probably there was no way to avoid these problems. Of course, well, any discussions on alternative history is a sort of speculation, but my understanding is that there were much more serious problems than just personalities of Brezhnev or Andropov or even Gorbachev.
If I may continue, Mark may continue the comment, I would make one very simple point. Don't forget that when Andropov died, oil prices were still very high. And his situation could last quite long if oil prices stood high. So in 85 and 86, oil prices started to drop, and Gorbachev found himself in severe financial crisis. Even when they didn't realize that it was a financial crisis, it was severe financial crisis. And another point, let me remind you that by this time in 1986, Soviet Union brought 46 million metric tons of grain to this country. Russia nowadays exports more than 50 million metric tons. Only Russia, which is the biggest exporter of grain. This is the difference of two economic systems. So Gorbachev had, on the one hand, very low oil prices, very high standards of living, and severe budget crisis.
I think that both of you have written about the problems of adequate state capacity or governance in the 1990s. And so I'd like now to turn towards this question. So there are two issues here. One is that the 1990s have a bad reputation historically. Many people look back on the 1990s as a terrible period of chaos and lawlessness. So for one thing, I'd like to ask you whether you think that reputation is justified. But beyond that, I'm also thinking that the solution to Russia's weak state capacity in the 90s was clearly to rebuild the state. But once you start to rebuild the state from above, an authoritarian outcome is almost inevitable. So let's start with your view of the 1990s, and then we'll move on to state capacity. So, Professor Mau, how do you look back on the 1990s?
Well, it was the worst of time, it was the best of time. It was very painful. A revolution is very difficult time, and revolution normally lasts about 12 years. So for me, revolution is just a period between roughly 87 to 99, 2000, something like this. And of course, revolution is a period of the collapse of the state, collapse of the government, for various reasons. We should not discuss now why. It's worth to talk about this, to read books about this. But it was a period when government cannot balance budget, when government cannot collect properly taxes, when budget deficit is not the result of the decision of the government, but the result of an ability of the government to make any clear statement about its economic capacity and economic prospects. By the way, at the end of the revolution, from this point of view, is a moment when budget is balanced and inflation and monetary policy stops playing the political role. So the 90s was a period which could solve two problems. First of all, it was a time when new institutions were mostly creating. Well, when Soviet Union collapsed, there was no tax system because Soviet taxes was a part in the government fixed price. Well, the youngsters and even middle-aged people do not understand how could it be. But again, there was no modern tax system with the market prices in the Soviet Union. There were no borders. Let's not forget that there were no state borders in this country. There was no 16 central banks, Soviet and 15 Republican, which could print money. And it's still a miracle that they didn't do this in proper terms. That was a period when no modern legislation existed, no institutions at all. And at last, it was a period when, by the end of 1991, the gold and currency reserves of Russian Federation was about $30 million. 30 million. When I say to journalists somewhere, they write 30 billion. They believe that it was a mistake, but they just cannot imagine what is 30 million as reserves for such country like Russia. So it was extremely difficult period, extremely difficult both for the governments and for people. But it was a period which we could go through without civil war. We put nuclear armaments from neighboring country back to Russia and solve this problem. And we created the basis for future economic growth. I wanted to state that economic growth in this country resumed not when oil prices started to grow, but when they were very low. The post-revolutionary economic growth started in the second half of 1999.
Prof Gelman, how do you look back on the 90s?
Yeah, I believe that there is a sort of bad luck for public perceptions of the 1990s. Because on the one hand, many problems of the 1990s emerged well before this period, and as Professor Mau stated that the long and protracted and deep recession in many ways was a side effect of collapse of the Soviet economy during late years of Gorbachev's period. On the other hand, economic growth of the 2000s was a side effect of reforms took in the 1990s. So blaming of this period for everything bad would be very much unfair. Yes, it was a difficult time, but this difficult time was probably inevitable because of complexity of the problems of what has been labeled as triple transition: reforming of political system, reforming of the economic system, and reform of state building because of its complete transformation in terms of boundaries, in terms of organizing center-periphery relations, and the like. And yes, Russia avoided the risk of this conflict with its neighbors, as Professor Mau stated. But also Russia avoided the risk of full-scale ethnic conflicts within Russia. With certainly important exception of Chechnya, it was the only case. Russian federal government made a lot of concessions to regional authorities. Many people blamed Yeltsin for his famous statement, "You can take as much sovereignty as you can swallow." But in a perspective, I would say it was probably the best available solution. Otherwise, Russia could face with the same threat which former Yugoslavia failed to avoid. And if we compare some sort of balance of positive signs and negative signs of the 1990s, I would say that Russia escaped the worst case scenarios and was able to keep its territorial integrity, more or less with an exception of Chechnya. Russia was able to avoid many disasters which could be inevitable without Gaidar's reforms, and even thought the price was very high. One should not put the blame on Russia's rulers exclusively. It would be very much unfair, but of course I understand very much those people who had very high hopes during Perestroika period and faced with economic hardships and many disillusionments of the 1990s. I was very critical to what Yeltsin and Gaidar did at that time. But over time, I realized that probably this blaming would be unjust and unfair, and one should take into account what were the real alternatives and what was the menu of choices. And I would say that it was probably not that much wrong. Thank you.
And if may I add a point more?
Sure.
Again, very simple economic point. Budget to GDP in the Soviet Union was about 64% budget to GDP. And in China, by the beginning of the reform, it was about 22, 26, I don't remember, as in any present economy. Of course, this budget to GDP was not about welfare state, it was about military procurement, it was about subsidies to agriculture, etc., but it was a source of living. And actually, it was clear by the end of the 80s and early 90s that transition to market will not maintain this level of budget burden. Because market economy of the Soviet GDP per capita level could not maintain 64% without administrative pressure, without all these elements of the Soviet administrative system. And this is very different with China. In the Soviet Union, the decreasing of social standards was inevitable part of this high oil price and high budget pressure to GDP. In China, any economic reform meant increasing of national revenue. That's why I remind it was a paper quite long ago for Gregory where he wrote very interesting point that Gorbachev from the very beginning tried to give much more freedom than Deng Xiaoping in the beginning of the reform. But Soviet infrastructure, Soviet people, Soviet enterprises didn't want this freedom because for them this freedom was connected with the increasing with the competition and risk of the decreasing standard. While for millions of hundreds of millions of Chinese farm peasants, it meant increasing of living standards. The bulk of Chinese population wanted more economic freedom. In the Soviet Union, most of the economic activity, most of the enterprises considered economic freedom and the opportunity to sell their products with the free prices while buying by the fixed prices. This is one of the reasons who supported price liberalization.
Thank you. There are so many topics that one could go on to discuss, but I'm going perhaps just to limit us to one more aspect of this. Looking back on the 1990s, the common narrative is not so much that it was Russia's leaders that were primarily to blame, but Western diplomatic pressure and Western advice. And the 1990s were a time of national humiliation for Russia. And again, I'd like just to ask for your perspectives on this. We'll go Professor Gelman and then Professor Mau, and then I'm going to turn to Judith to ask her to tell us about questions from the audience. So, Professor Gelman.
Yeah, my understanding that the impact of the West on the Soviet collapse and particularly on post-Soviet reforms was fairly limited. Actually, Western observers and policymakers failed to expect the Soviet collapse, and just some months before it, George Bush Sr. Warned Ukraine against the drive for independence, although it was already inevitable by that time. And my understanding that what happens in December 1991 was shocking, and the West mostly concerned about issues of nuclear arms rather than about anything else. And there were some sort of high expectations from the Russian government, and these expectations related to large-scale economic assistance from the West, and then there was a sudden disillusionment when it became clear that there will be no major aid in the period of 1992, 1993 or so. There is an excellent volume of interviews called Gaidar's Revolution by Peter and Alfred Koch, interviews with former members of the Russian government, and this is one of the common topics of these interviews. But at the same time, I believe that there was a sort of perception that, okay, the Cold War is over, the West won in this Cold War, and why we should invest a lot of efforts into Russia without some sort of additional incentives. And by and large, I believe that Russia's developments in the 1990s and later on were driven by domestic factors rather than by international agenda, for good or for bad, I don't know, but it is the matter of fact. So I would not praise the West or blame the West for what happens in Russia in the 1990s. It's more or less a domestic business.
Thank you. Professor Mau?
I would say it is completely domestic. You know, we often discuss economic strategies, and I'm often asked a question why most of the economic strategies were not realized. My standard answer is that when you have in more or less stable and growing economy with a high level of unpredictability of technologies, you just cannot draw a plan which will be fully realized. And this is the only one strategy, only one plan in this country which was realized and which could be realized, which could have been realized. And I hope that would never leave to this time that the new plan, which will be definitely realized, appear. I mean the plan of Gaidar. Because when you have 4-digit inflation, when you have a budget deficit of 20% of GDP, or foreign debt and foreign currency more than 100% of GDP, there is no any choice what you can do. This is a standard action and did not need foreign advisors. All countries did roughly the same in this situation. The discussion begins when macroeconomic crisis is overcome. That's why I would say I wouldn't believe I wouldn't say that I saw any important role of international advisors. They were a good deal. Well, the typical economic advisor was a guy who came to Russia, spent a few days in this country, wrote a few lines in memo, and then came back to the States or Europe and said that he was advisor to Yeltsin. So when it was fashionable, very soon it became unfashionable, and all of them said that they had given a good advice, but the country failed to realize it. So in the situation of severe macroeconomic crisis, you do not need advisor. You need just knowledge what to do. And that's why Gaidar, for instance, sometimes said that his tasks were extremely painful, but intellectually very simple. Because how to stabilize a completely imbalanced economy, most everybody knows. Not many people have courage to start to realize this policy. It's much more difficult to establish, to pursue policy of healthcare modernization, of modernization of education, modernization of the armaments, when you have really choices. In fall of 1991, there was no choice. The only choice was who would take who would be political suicide, who would take political responsibility for the course, which was absolutely clear.
Thank you, both of you. We give the audience a turn. Judith.
Yes, gosh, this is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? We've got quite a few questions coming in, and I'll try to put them in some sort of order. Some of them are a little bit the same, but I'm going to start with Carol Leonard. I'm delighted that you're out there, Carol. And Carol is asking actually about Gaidar, and she wants to know whether Gaidar was fairly isolated in his decision-making on price liberalization. She recalls, Professor Mau, that you mentioned that you were skeptical. Were others too?
Well, many people might be skeptical, but you know, why? But at the same time, many people, almost everybody chaotically supported this. That was a very interesting point. I never wrote about this, but that was two sources of general support of price liberalization. One was that a broad audience, broad public, was sick and tired of commodity shortages. You can't imagine what does it mean when you have a 6 months child and you cannot buy milk for him or her. That when there are long lines and when government tried to do everything and failed to do it. And one of the total broad demand was do something to avoid this situation when there is no food stuff in their stores. And working in the government, one part of my responsibility was analysis of the storage of foodstuff in main cities. It was about 4 to 6 days in most of the cities. So it was very dangerous, very painful. The second reason is, I partly mentioned it, that enterprises considered and directors of enterprises considered oil price liberalization as their ability to put any price on their commodity. They did. This country during 60 years didn't understand what did it mean, the lack of demand. The lack of supply, a lot, but not the lack of demand. I remember my first meeting in the government when the director of one big car making factory asked Gaidar whether he would be able to sell his trucks by any price. Gaidar said, of course, to any client, if you were able to do it. And he believed that it was a stupid guy. My trucks, this is a line for my trucks. The other companies are ready to buy it for any price. Money is not in shortage. The trucks are in shortage. So enterprise didn't realize what is the limited demand. Limited demand didn't exist from middle of the 20s. It was a limit of supply and not shortages of money. That's why partially it was again the problem that situation was really very hard, and partially it was not really understanding what would be the consequences of price liberalization for any single commodity producer. Again, don't forget that it was that most of the authorities and business are starving for import. Only a year after price liberalization, the problem of import emerged as the problem of competition of foreign goods. at the fall of 1991 and most of the 1992, there was no such a problem as competition for commodities. Everybody wanted foreign commodities to fill the market.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. I'll sort of alternate between the speakers, if that's all right. So don't worry, this is to the audience, if I seem to have jumped over one of your questions, we'll come back to it. So this is, I think this is probably to both of you, but I'm going to put it to Vladimir Gelman first. And this is from Christine Papalot. She says the administrative structures of the late Soviet state had hypothetically the possibility of being turned into basically democratic institutions. So she asks, why was the power of the communal structures, for example, in the provinces, not strengthened instead of heading towards a central presidential system? So if we can start with you for that, Professor.
Yeah, actually, there was a problem of reorganization of the Russian state in the time of deep economic crisis. In fact, there was very much spontaneous decentralization because of the central government was simply not able to control what regional governments do. And this was very much a process of informal bargaining between the central government and most powerful provincial leaders, which later on was institutionalized in a form of bilateral treaties, some sort of exceptions from general rules and the like. And I would say that it was to a great degree a side effect of the Soviet collapse, and to some degree was driven by the need of the central authorities to have regional leaders as their political allies. Later on, in the 2000s, there was a reverse wave of recentralization of the Russian state, but it was the other story. In the 1990s, the central government was simply not able to do something with very powerful provincial leaders who were able to concentrate a lot of resources in their hands, ranging from Tatarstan to the city of Moscow. And again, there was a compromise which was inefficient in many ways, but it was a sort of peaceful ad hoc solution. And most probably there were very limited alternatives to such an approach.
And Professor Mau, do you want to add to that?
Well, I'm as a stupid economist. You know, the heritage, Soviet period influenced the structure of the economic geography, the structure of location of economic activity severely. It was a non-economic logic. It was subsidies to the place where it was necessary to do. So the result of the consequences of the Soviet economic geography, the consequences of the Soviet relocation of economic activity was that there were many absolutely uneven places. There were a lot of localities which could not survive without distribution. Many localities, and you could not just change the structure, not only overnight, even in decades. So originally, the huge part of Russian municipals could not survive without redistribution, and many regions as well. But with Minsk, also it's complete, and it's a very difficult problem. You cannot develop any tax system which could avoid them live basically on taxation they raise from them. So it has again, it has all. Accepting what Professor Gelman has said from political point of view, but it had severe and tough economic reasons.
Professor
Gelman, to the answers, but I just want to say I think that was a great question. It tells us a lot about what was happening in the 90s. Thank you.
No, I was just wondering, Mark, whether Professor Gelman wanted to sort of comment on what Professor Mau just said.
Well, I would agree that this legacy of Soviet economic planning and of the Soviet territorial division played an important role in these developments. And yes, many of Russia's regions and municipalities are economically not self-subsistent, and they are highly dependent upon federal subsidies in form of transfers or grants or whatsoever, and this was one of the constraints toward further disintegration. Actually, many people were surprised why the Soviet Union did collapse, but Russia did not. And one of the answers was related to this use of fiscal transfers as a leverage of central control. There is an excellent book by Daniel Treisman called After the Deluge, and he analyzed this logic in many details.
Right. There's a sort of follow another question that is on this general area from Annalisa Husala. How do you assess the role of slow, challenging public sector reforms in the difficulties of the 1990s? What should have been done differently? What can be learned from these developments today? Either of you, I think. Perhaps you, Vladimir? Can you? Sorry, you're both Vladimir, sorry. Younger Vladimir.
Okay, maybe called Vladimir the First and Vladimir the Second, similarly to Modros. Speaking more seriously, my understanding that public sector reform was not a top priority in the period of the 1990s for two major reasons. One is that, of course, what Professor Mau mentioned, these problems of macroeconomic stabilization and struggling with numerous other issues were on agenda, and public sector reform was, how to say, postponed to the second wave of reforms which were launched in the period of this post-revolutionary stabilization in the 2000s. And again, it was another story. The second problem was that there was so big political instability. Because of conflict between president and the parliament in 1993, then very contentious presidential elections of 1996, and the like, that probably launching of these large-scale reforms were not much politically feasible. To what extent this time was lost for major transformation? Well, it's a matter of further discussions, but I would say that most probably it could be quite unrealistic to expect major public sector reforms during this period of long and deep economic recession and high political instability.
Thank you. So we have another 2 or 3 questions, and then I think we're going to have to call it a day. So I've tried to put them in some sort of chronological order, but I'll end with one particular question for all the panelists. But this one is to Professor Mau, and it's in your very well-known book, Challenge of Revolution. You ended with a prediction about the post-revolutionary dictatorship. You said it would be fairly mild and soon come to nothing. And the question is, how far do you think the last 2 decades have matched your expectations?
This book was published in 2001, and 20 years passed. Of course, you know, as late Rudy Dorbush, who died at the same year, used to say that second law of economic of Cass says that crisis happens later than you predict, but earlier than you expect. And of course, this is about any prediction. It's about any prediction. Of course, but in the same book, in the same conclusions, we wrote also about the political revolutions which followed the Great Revolution, and political and economic systems differs radically. What was my point, very important, there is no logic after revolution. Revolution has some logic because it's based on chaotic development. Government cannot control anything, or almost anything. And restoration of the government means the end of revolution. There is no logic and clear stage in non-revolutionary period. And this is important.
Right, thank you. And there's another question here, again, along the same, well, no, it's actually, this one's quite different, and it's about how effective the government was in communicating to the general public the points of the reforms. So the question is from Irina Neustroeva, who asks, were there any governmental attempts at mitigating the impact of the reforms through proper communication via any state propaganda channels? Could you perhaps comment on that, Professor Mau, and then Professor Gelman?
Well, I don't believe in efficient propaganda without efficient strong political rule, political or military rule. So you can easily communicate and explain something when the situation is going better in the short run. But it was populism in the early 90s. So many people complain or blame the first post-communist government that it was not very strong in public relations. But again, when you live in the situation of complete collapse of all state institutions, it's very difficult to communicate. I don't believe in communication. Well, you know, I work in the university, you know, now it's very popular to say that the soft skills is very important in the 21st century. I often say that soft skills are very important when you have hard skills. There is no soft skills without efficient soft skills without hard skills. Soft skills without hard skills means crookery. So for good communication, you needed good economic basis. But I'm again with my liberal Marxism.
And Vladimir II.
Yeah, I agree with Vladimir I, because, more efficient communication could help somehow, but it could not make a major difference. And actually, it is a problem, I believe, for any sort of revolutionary crisis similar to those of Russia. If we would have a look on many other revolutions, probably problems with communication were nearly the same. And this is why one should not expect that some things may be completely different if some PR genius could help guide us government, probably not much.
Right, we have a question from Christian Colina. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. And it's about legal culture. And it is saying that there's a proposition that Tsarism and socialism left Russia without a proper legal culture. And the question is, how do you think the Soviet collapse impacted on Russian legal development? So I'm very happy, Vladimir II.
Okay. Let me start, and Professor Mau will follow. My understanding that the major problem of the Soviet collapse for post-Soviet legal developments was not much related to culture, but rather to institutions, as many Soviet institutions either lost their relevance or were not able to perform their functions. And in such a situation, Russia had to establish its new institutions nearly from scratch. And of course, law enforcement was very much in disarray in the 1990s because of the deep and protracted recession. Basically, it means that, judges and police officers not received their salaries, had very limited opportunities to enforce their own decisions and the like, and there was a process of substitution of these legal institutions by some criminal businesses, what was brilliantly described by Vadim Volkov in his book on violent entrepreneurship. And from this perspective, it was quite problematic, much greater than cultural effects, which were probably less meaningful in practical terms.
Right, thank you. I do have one final question for all the panelists, and I'm including Mark in this because you've been quiet for a little bit too long, Mark. And this is going right back to 1991, a good note to finish on, and it comes from Marie Dangerfeld-Schoenberg, and she would like to hear your opinion about why so many professionals failed to predict the end of the Soviet Union. I'm going to start with Mark, because he is another stupid economist, but he's also a professional. So Mark, let's hear, why did we miss it? And then I'll ask Vladimir I and Vladimir II, and then I'm afraid we have to draw it to a close. Mark.
So there are some things that were easy to see, and the thing that was easy to see at that time in the late 80s was that there was a complex of growing problems facing the Soviet leadership, and they were all getting worse at the same time. and I could see that, and I think many people could see that. The hard thing was to predict the consequences and the timing of how it worked out. And, we've heard it called a revolution tonight, but I think this is a problem that affects all revolutions. That is, if you can predict the revolution, then you can also prevent it. And it's of the nature of revolution that it takes people by surprise. If you look at the Iranian Revolution, if you look at the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, all of these, the French Revolution was a shock to highly informed diplomats across Europe. And so the Russian or the Soviet Revolution in 1991 is not the first revolution to come as a surprise. And to me, it's simply something intrinsic to the phenomenon. You can understand trends, you can understand where events are pointing in a gradual, deterministic way, but what you cannot predict is the political initiative that breaks the deadlock and creates a new future. That's my perspective. So I don't apologize for any, on behalf of anyone or myself. I think it's in the nature of history that the human race is very bad at forecasting. Full stop.
Right. And perhaps that section of the human race called economists, but we'll put that on one side.
No, we're the same. It's not a secret.
Yeah. Vladimir the First, would you like to add to that or challenge it?
It's more complicated to my mind situation. First of all, in previous 20 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were two predictions which came not from economists and not from the people from the area. Well, I would separate, by the way, economists and the people from the area studies. I would remind you, that was Al-Mari, who wrote his famous phrase, and it was Ronald Reagan, who said that Soviet Union will not survive this century. So there were two very clear, and everybody was laughing because everybody knows that Soviet Union was forever. Forever unless it ended, as it was written in another book. But, if you look further in time, it was, I completely agree with Mark that the third law of economic forecast says that you can predict either date or data, but never the both. And this is also an important case. But if you look at the writings of various economists just after the Bolshevik Revolution, all of them wrote that the regime would be unsustainable, that it would not survive. Bolsheviks believed that it would be forever. Both were right, because for those who lived by this time, it was forever for their life. But originally, the early economists were right because the system turned out to be unsustainable, but 70 years later. So either date or data, they do not coincide.
Thank you very much. And Vladimir II.
Yeah, I would remind about two other forecasts of the Soviet collapse. One was proposed by Andrei Amalrik, who predicted everything except for the time. He wrote a very powerful essay, Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? But actually his substantive points were somehow valid because he predicted the loss of control over Eastern Europe, ideology ideological divisions within the Communist Party and the like. Well, he misattributed causes with Soviet-Chinese relations as a potential trigger event. It never happens, but it was very natural given the fact that his essay was written after very serious tensions between the Soviet Union and China. And another one was Kardankos, who correctly predicted, almost correctly, that the Soviet Union will cease to exist in 1990. She missed just a year, but she attributed sources of potential Soviet collapse to Islamic revival in the Soviet Central Asia, which never was the case by that time, and still to be not a top issue in Central Asia even by now. So this is true that, well, social scientists, not only economists, but also political scientists and international relations experts are notoriously bad in making correct predictions, but at the same time, not all predictions are completely useless, and some of them worth certain considerations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that were we in the main hall at Robinson College in Cambridge, that the audience would be standing and there would be prolonged applause for this session. I would like to thank the two speakers for a totally fascinating session of both reminiscences and deep analysis. And thank also Mark Harrison very much indeed for sort of engaging with the questions and engaging with the two of you. So thank you very much indeed. And on the question, yes, yes, I would also, I'd just like to finish by saying that we hope we can actually invite you all in person to a BASEES conference in Cambridge or in Glasgow, where we might be going the year after next. And I would just like to remind all of you out there in the audience that there's still time to propose papers and panels for next April's BASEES conference, which we are confident is going to take place in person and in Cambridge. So please do that. The deadline has been extended to October the 24th. But thank you all very much indeed for attending today, and thank you again to our speakers.
Thank you for organizing this event, to our organizers, and thanks to the audience for the interest, for your thought-provoking questions, and we will be in touch. Your mic.
Usually. Thank you very much, Judith, Vladimir, Mark. It was and it is a great pleasure to talk to you. And we see now the distance is not a barrier for us. Of course, we're driven either to come to you or to see you here, say at GADAC Forum or in other our events. So let's continue communication. And if I may ask BASEES to continue this type of discussion, that would be absolutely great. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, and let me add my thanks. Professor Mau, Professor Gelman, thank you very, very much.